के लिए रसायन विज्ञान द्वारा लाया गया।
Brought to you by chemistry.
Hello everyone and welcome to Brought to you by Chemistry. What's brought to you by chemistry, I hear you ask? Complicated reactions, complicated exams, even more complicated romances? Yes. But in this case, it's also a new podcast series from the Royal Society of Chemistry. So you see the branding there. My name is Dr. Alex Lathbridge, and in this series, we're taking a look at plastics, bringing together experts from inside and outside the chemistry world to help us understand the ins and outs of all things plastic. Now, plastics are, of course, a valuable resource, no doubt about that. But plastics aren't necessarily fantastic when you think about how we've used them, especially when it comes to the environment. As consumers, we only see a small fraction of the life cycle of a product, and we're often very concerned about where it goes after we've used it. But what happens before that? What happens before we even get it? How's the product made? How's it transported? And what impact does all of that have on the environment? So today we're looking at something called life cycle analysis. So this is the idea that the environmental impact of a product starts right from when that product is produced and lasts all the way until it's reached the end of its life and has been disposed of. Now, this is a very, very, very complicated thing. So today with us, I have two wonderful experts, one from inside the chemistry world and one from outside the chemistry world, both fantastic. From inside our chemistry world, we have Charnett Chau. And our non-chemistry expert is Ruth Strange. Now, I'm going to start with Charnett.
Hi, I'm Charnett Chau. I work at UCL. I'm a research fellow at the UCL Plastic Waste Innovation Hub. So as part of my job is to look at the environmental impact of plastic systems and how, what are the environmental impacts of future intervention that we want to put in place in our society.
And our non-chemistry expert, our real-world expert. Can I get you to introduce yourself? Say a couple of things about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Ruth and I work at Ethical Consumer magazine. Been there for about 5 or 6 years, and we do product guides to all the, a lot of the things that people buy. That we've got over 100 different guides, and we look at a whole range of issues for the companies that make those products, and plastic packaging is one of the many things we look at.
Wonderful. Now, Ruth, you're going to hear a lot of talk about things called life cycle analysis, and you're going to think about the ethics and all of that. But first, I'm going to start with Charnett. And so I've got some very interesting questions about a very interesting subject that until maybe 6 minutes ago, I had no idea existed. So please, could you use your chemistry knowledge and explain what is life cycle analysis?
Life cycle assessment is a methodology used to evaluate environmental impacts of a product or process or a system over its life cycle. And you put it quite nicely in terms of what happens at when we extract the materials from the ground, or when we manufacture or manipulate these materials into products, how we use it and what happens to it at end of life. So this life cycle assessment, we look at the input and outputs, or elementary flows of each life cycle stage. We then look at what does that mean to the environment. So converting these inputs and outputs to environmental impacts, we look at a range of different types of environmental impact, not just climate change, not just global warming potential, but other impacts such as acidification, eutrophication, ecotoxicity, etc. So then we can properly compare different systems and having a look at what are the trade-off in terms of current system, or when we look at a new implementation or new scenario of in the future as well.
Okay. And so from how you explained it, it's super diverse. You consider so many different factors, and you talked about all these different areas that it can affect, especially the big one around climate change. That's the thing I think about when I'm trying to think about what plastics I use or whether I should stop using plastics. And In the last year, one of the big things that I've been thinking about, one of the big things that everyone's been thinking about in terms of like waste has been, our masks. For COVID-19, we've all been wearing masks. Now, some people, like me, have these very snazzy reusable ones. You can just about see it because, I mean, the color is amazing. But I only really started doing that recently. Before then, I was just using, these reusable ones. Now, with masks, is that something you've looked at, right?
Yes. So as a hub, back last year, before the first lockdown of ending, the government was advising everyone to wear face masks. So what we know back then was there's not really marketable reusable face masks, but most people would use single-use face masks. And at that point, we knew that single-use face masks are typically made of plastic fabric or fabric material. So polypropylene, non-woven fabrics are typically what is made of the surgical masks, or even the more higher rated FFP masks, like FFP2, FFP3 masks that are used in medical or in healthcare. We did a study looking at what if everyone in the UK were to use a single-use face mask every day versus what if everyone uses reusable face mask. And we did a life cycle assessment on that, and as well as cost analysis and behavior analysis on both of these scenarios. And it does came out that in terms of wastage, reusing face masks compared to single use, we have a lot less waste generated, as well as less, like as a whole, in terms of climate change or all the other environmental impact, it is a lot lower. Having said that, there are trade-offs in the sense where using single-use face masks, people don't need to wash it. So then there's a higher, as compared to reusable face masks, there's a lot less impact associated with washing. So like less soap is used, less water is used from that sense. But as a whole, if you look at all the different types of environmental impact, it is less environmentally harmful to use reusable masks.
Ruth, all these questions coming to you from here in South London to all the way to you in West Germany. It feels like we're in the 90s now. Okay, even though I asked, can you explain a little bit about Ethical Consumer Magazine?
Yeah, so we look at the companies behind the brands. So we're looking at the company behavior across a company group, like what other companies might be part of the same family, as well as looking at the product itself and the materials. We have a rating system that's all explained on our website. So we look at we look for indicators on a range of issues under different main headings: environment, people, animals, and politics. So under environment, we look for example, whether a company has targets to reduce its impact. Also under there is climate change. So we look at whether they are reporting on their emissions, and we assess them on their approach to pollutions and toxics. And if they use ingredients like palm oil or cotton, we look at that as well, depending on what sector they're in. Increasingly, we are looking at packaging as well, or how to avoid it. But actually, it's often the ingredients inside products and materials that have a much bigger impact than the actual packaging.
I've not bought Ethical Consumer, but I've been on your website and I've seen it's not just the materials going in. It's their companies, like their rights to give workers to allow workers to unionize. It's really looking at the ethics of everything. Because the world is very complicated. So, generally, when you're advising your readers on the most ethical or sustainable products, what are the main aspects that you take into account? How do you decide exactly which products to recommend? And, do you find yourself recommending plastic products over something else?
Okay, so we have this rating system under these 4 main headings. So after we've rated each company on whichever of those are relevant to them. So it would including supply chain management, whether they're members of lobby groups or using likely tax avoidance strategies, whether they're paying their directors excessively.
Oh, wow.
All sorts of things.
You really go in.
Yeah.
Wow, this is investigative journalism. What?
So we can't always find the information, but we go on what's publicly available through internet research or campaign group reports and news reports and things like that. So it's not just the direct environmental impact, but if they are members of lobby groups or they're using tax avoidance strategies or they're paying their directors excessively or just shareholders above other concerns, then they are holding society back from acting on concerns such as plastic pollution, and they're holding individuals back by increasing inequality in society so that not everyone has the same choices about what they're going to buy because they can't necessarily afford the best options. So companies can impact all these issues in so many different ways. So we try to, once we've done all those ratings, our database throws out a score, calculates the score, and all the companies on our score table, we end up with a score table either in the magazine or on their website. Some companies will rise to the top and some will fall to the bottom with whatever the scores they've got. And based on that, mainly based on the score, we can pick out the best buys and just under them the recommendations. But there might be things that aren't really captured by the scores, like we don't have a rating to cover everything. So there might be other things that come into that decision as well. So you won't always have the best companies. Some of the companies we recommend might not be right at the top of the table, but we're also sometimes just recommending buying less.
Oh, really? No, but why do you recommend buying less?
So you might have heard the phrase like the best mobile phone you have, if you're trying to choose an ethical phone or something, the most ethical one is the one you already own. Like, why do you need to upgrade? Do you need the newest thing? Or maybe there's a library of things in your area where you can share products. Maybe you don't need to buy whatever it is, hedge trimmers or something. If it's something you only use occasionally, you can be sharing that with other people. And yeah, we don't necessarily need to buy so many packaged products. Like, for example, do you need hair conditioner if you can just use a drop of cider vinegar in some water? There's always other options. And a lot of our readers will send us lots of ideas as well.
As a black man, I can tell you, I do need conditioner. I need the many leave-ins I have. Okay, so maybe that's not for me. But with that in mind, but who buys Ethical Consumer Magazine, and why do you think they do it? Like, why do they care so much? Because obviously, you are super passionate about this.
I think so. We do a markets report annually called the Ethical Consumer Markets Report, and that analyzes how much are people spending on these kind of things, like are they choosing organic over non-organic or fair trade, or are they trying to reduce plastic? And the spend in these kind of alternative ethical choices is going up year by year generally. So I think just more and more people care about or are aware of all these different issues, and it can come from something really well known, like the advert that was on the Greenpeace Iceland advert about palm oil, or the David Attenborough series. When something big like that happens, lots more people get interested in particular issues. I just think if you're not distracted, you will care. So
with that, what can big companies do to avoid earning the ire of Ethical Consumer Magazine? Do you think these manufacturers, do they need to be more transparent about the impacts of their products? I mean, what do you think they can do to help consumers, consumers who really care about this stuff but don't have all the information? How can they help them make better decisions or be more informed?
So yeah, they can definitely be more transparent in their information about their products, and also in how they talk about their ethics. So an example is a lot of companies we've looked at around their palm oil use, they will say we don't use palm oil, and that may be true, but palm oil can also be used to make lots of derivative ingredients, and they, in household or cosmetic products, they might be used far more than actual palm oil itself. And a company can hide that by saying we don't use palm oil and not mentioning the derivatives. I wish companies were more transparent and more honest, but unfortunately for profit-driven companies, that's not always their priority. So we often rely on campaign groups to uncover these things. There are other models, though, of businesses that are more likely to address these kind of things, like benefit corporations, B Corps, people might have heard of.
What are B Corps?
It stands for benefit corporation. So
Okay.
I think it started in America, but there are companies in the UK using this as well. And it just means that environmental and community and employer considerations have to be taken into account alongside shareholder, profits for shareholders. So they have to legally, they've chosen a business model that means they have to consider those other things as well.
And so, I mean, your consumers, your readers are probably pretty savvy about this sort of stuff. But, what advice do you have for the rest of us, I guess? How can we make more ethical decisions around plastics? What would help us?
So, we do have a subscription to the magazine, and that costs something, but the website, you can look at that for free. There's loads of stuff on there. You can search for company names or different issues like microplastics or whatever it is that you want to find out about on our website. You'll find stuff. So in terms of plastics in particular, we can all try to be more aware of and avoid the more obvious forms of plastic, like water bottles. Like you can have a reusable bottle or just reuse one bottle many times. Or, like you could buy a bar of soap instead of liquid soap in a bottle. So you can avoid the obvious plastics. But there's also hidden plastics that are worth knowing about as well. So, for example, in cosmetics, you might find in a lot of cosmetics, there are microplastics. And do you want a shocking statistic that I had to check because I couldn't believe it?
There are people in this chat who would most definitely love a shock. I would like a shocking statistic. Ruth, hit me with a shocking statistic. It better be good.
So the average person each week ingests about 5 grams of microplastics through water, food, or air. And that's like the weight of a credit card each of us is ingesting every week. So if you imagine a credit card, we're eating that every week. I just couldn't believe it.
I feel as though a situation in which you're eating a credit card is like, what would you have to done in your life where you're like, oh no, the only way I can get out of this is eating my credit card. That chip and pin needs to be in my gullet quick. That's incredible and depressing, like incredibly depressing. How do we get out of that? Is there anything that we can do right now to not eat, 5 grams of microplastics?
So not directly, like that is in the air, it's in the water. That's a result of how much plastic has been used in all sorts of industries. Most of our clothes are made of plastic in the form of polyester or acrylic or whatever. It's in all the packaging. It's everywhere. You can't just remove it from the environment. But there's loads and loads of things that can be done to start to address that. So even like to what bank you use, like Barclays and HSBC are like 4th and 6th in the world for financing plastic production. So switch your bank, for example, or buying less but buying better stuff. Like, for example, we just did a guide on laundry detergent, washing up liquids and dishwasher detergents, 3 different guides, and discovered that, I suppose if you live in one place, like I was living in Derby for 17 years, just until recently, you only see the shops in your town, but actually there's an explosion of zero waste shops and, plastic-free shops all over the country. And so in our latest laundry guide, there's a list of places that have refill stations. There's 6 companies on there that have lists of refill stations all around the country. You can put your postcode in and find out the alternative shops near you. And all of those shops will be full of inspiring alternatives, not just to refill those kind of products, but other things as well. Or you might see a poster for an event or a group that you could get involved in. There's loads of stuff going on there that can be done. And it can be overwhelming. This is one of the things that I think about with the work that we do. Like, if you get all this information, it can feel like what can I do about that? You know, it's so big and it's everywhere, but it's better to just take small steps and see what fits into your life and what's around you and what your friends are interested in. Anything that can keep you going on small steps rather than getting overwhelmed, I think is worth doing.
I mean, yeah, because I've been writing down while we've been speaking, and so I have to check if my bank is bad. I have to check whether or not anything I have that doesn't say palm oil has palm oil derivatives. So I have to go on Wikipedia and look at palm oil derivatives. I have to also check the clothes that I'm wearing. I have to also not buy bars of soap and not shampoo, and maybe check if I can refill the shampoo or other things I use. This is a lot. This is painfully a lot. Like, you know,
that's the thing. Don't think about it all at once. Yeah, you've got all that written down now, but obviously you're not going to deal with it all at once. Like, just think about maybe the one thing you'd like to look at first or something.
You're making me want to be more ethical. So like, I feel like I can make a change, but oh God, I've been terrible. What do you do, Ruth? Let's turn it back to you. Ruth, what are you doing in your day-to-day to reduce your plastic consumption, Ruth?
Okay, so I'm definitely not here to like guilt trip you.
I'm
just because you're like, Ruth, what are you doing? So I mean, I've always kind of not bought a lot. I think I just picked that up from my mum, who was doing it more for economical reasons, but just don't buy a lot. Like, buy a lot of secondhand stuff. Use whole food shops or those kind of shops that are going to have the alternative brands that are mission driven rather than profit driven. And then just little things like, you know, having a refillable bottle, having a reusable bag, you know, just simple things like that. If you're someone who likes to get takeaway coffee, having a reusable cup. Yeah, mainly it's like not just buying loads of things without thinking about the impact of them.
On balance, like, is it a 50-50 thing? You know, consumers can do so much. Consumers can only do so much. It's down to like manufacturers and also like, you know, shops. Like, if you're thinking about getting a takeaway coffee and you want to come in with your reusable cup, making sure that, you know, that like your coffee shop actually allows you to do that or has an incentive for you to do that. Like, there needs to be a balance, right?
Totally. It's definitely not only the consumer's responsibility. And I was reading something this morning. Let me see if I can remember. No, but I would recommend that. No, I was looking at a report to prepare for this. I was just looking at a report called Bankrolling Plastics. That's where I got that figure about Barclays being the fourth in the world.
So good. I'm not with Barclays.
And it was talking about how when the plastics industry took off in terms of packaging and things, they kind of deflected attention from their own responsibility by starting litter campaigns. So like Keep America Beautiful, I think it was called. And it was like big brands like Coca-Cola and other brands, I think, started that to kind of say it's the consumer's responsibility to take care of this problem, when really it's them making their huge profits and putting these products out there and tempting you with their advertising. It's much more the responsibility of the corporations, but what we can do is support the alternatives and raise awareness and gradually put pressure to change things. It's not our fault, but we can do something about it.
Wonderful. And on that note, thank you so much, Ruth. Those are all of my questions to you. I went from being high to like depressed, and now I feel like activist. I feel like I can make a change. How does life cycle assessment, how does it translate into like the real world, sort of real life? How do we see it?
How do I see it? It's interesting how people do engage with our research. So, for instance, the mask work, we published it, and you do see people engage in terms of being able to think about their actions or considering, okay, the waste they produce and engaging with the fact that, okay, maybe using a reusable mask is more environmentally friendly than using single use. We do so like life cycle assessment in terms of translating into real life. It's a tool for, I guess, for the general public or like a society make a choice. So putting more evidence-based finding on the environmental impacts of the two systems, and you can choose which one, which action to take. So we have other studies as well, including like construction or even using tree shelters for planting trees. And we did, that's a recent study we did, and that's recently published as well. And it's to coincide, to advise on, I guess, the UK strive to plant 2 billion trees in like the next like 20, 30 years to meet the UK net zero target. And planting trees is an important activity because it will sequester a load of CO2. But then if we need to use plastic tree shelters to do it, what are the benefits and what are the cons? It is to do, the piece of work is to advise on when best to not use it or when best is to use it, because the product itself isn't unsustainable per se, but it's the system we have in it. So if we got a way to dispose of it environmentally, then maybe it is a good product to use.
How can research make planting trees bad? It's meant to be a good thing, but you're telling me there are pros and cons.
It is a good thing but if you think about the life cycle of planting trees, you have typically trees are planted first in tree nurseries. So then there's the electricity, the fertilizers used or water usage in a tree nursery, and then we have to transport it to the planting site. So then there's emissions associated with transporting it because we need fuel to take it there. We typically do need packaging on these trees to transport it safely. So then there's waste coming out of these packaging, having to dispose of them. So then to minimize the need to replant trees, we use plastic tree shelters. So to help it weathering damage or animal grazing. So that's the benefit of using plastic tree shelters in that sense, where it stops it from dying. So, but then after that, a lot of the time planting trees wise, a lot of these plastic tree shelters are not taken away to dispose because they do degrade eventually, and that does cause microplastics. So then our study does look at the environmental impact of not using tree shelters. So without using tree shelters, the tree doesn't survive as much. So the lower trees, the less tree survival rate means that you do need to replant trees. So replanting trees mean more activities at tree nurseries and more activities into driving these trees to the planting site. So then there are trade-offs in terms of what are the correct balance in terms of when is best to use tree shelters and when is it okay to not, kind of thing. So yeah, it's a tricky question to answer ultimately, because it does depend on the tree survival rate or the areas, how much animals is there that will eat the trees if you don't put a shelter in, that kind of thing. So that is a bit of a predicament.
Okay, and seeing as she's still here, Ruth, you are still here, and so I'm gonna ask you, sort of weighing in on this. This feels very much like Newsnight, and it's not. But Charnett does it from the the research aspect, sort of the very top of this, and you with ethical consumer, you're seeing it from the other side. So as someone who, I guess, someone who advises people on the best way of consuming ethically, what do you sort of think about this entire sort of work, this life cycle assessment?
So there are people in ethical consumer who know more about life cycle assessment than I do, but no, I think it's obviously really important because you don't want there to be hidden costs that you hadn't realized, and you want to be able to make a sensible decision based on actual information. But I'm just wondering if sometimes there might be a different, so when you get studies, they're done at a particular scale, or maybe they're designed for a particular situation, like if we're going to be bringing fruit from the other side of the world and making juice for people here to drink, then there's things you can do to minimize the impacts, but maybe we could rethink the whole model and not be bringing fruit from the other side of the world and not need all that packaging. I don't know. So I'm just thinking,
yeah, so
if that makes sense.
that does make sense. That's part of life cycle thinking, right? So when we carry out life cycle assessment, we do set out different scenarios. So even for our face mask study, we primarily modeled the manufacture of masks, say in China, that has a high environmental impact because we're transporting it. So a lot of the impact comes from transporting. So to look at another scenario would be manufacturing in, say, Turkey, where they produce a lot of textiles in Turkey, or even, say, manufactured in the UK. But then when we trying to model these, taking like data from our partners, we do realize that, okay, so UK is a high importer of textiles, so there's still going to be some sort of impact of materials, because we don't, UK don't specifically produce high amounts of textiles, that kind of thing. We do take into that account. So we do put another scenarios where, okay, cool, maybe we can manufacture other type of mask in the UK. So whenever we do a study, we do try and see how best we can optimize the scenario, or like the system that we can do. But also there is restraint in terms of what we could physically model as well, because we need the data in terms of, or is it feasible? Because we do need to consider whether that's cost beneficial, whether people would actually do it in terms of behavior as well. So taking into account, we build scenarios around that.
Yeah, can I just say another thing on
that?
So
go for it.
I think this is a dilemma that we have as well, in that if you want to put out a message that's going to work for the most people, that might be different than the message that you would put out if you were talking just in your local area and you had, if that makes sense.
Yes,
I did know what I was trying to say, and
I know what you mean. A lot of our work on compostable plastic is that when we look at compostable plastic and how we dispose compostable plastic, is that some local authorities don't take it to say IVZs, or they don't have an anaerobic digesters in the local authority. So then like the compostable product will end up in landfill or like incineration regardless. So then in terms of on a local authority level, how would you advise the public where to dispose of these materials would be different, because then to try and form the most sustainable way of disposing something is also, like you said, it's a very like restricted to locally. So they might say, okay, it's okay to throw it in the food waste system because the IVC or the AD in that area have agreed that they can take compostable plastic, but then other areas, the waste contractors may not have agreed. So then you're not supposed to put it in the food waste bin, etc. So it is very hard to streamline the advice that we can give, I suppose. Yeah.
And like with that, because you're giving this advice and it's going to these manufacturers, or I mean, it goes to many different parties and that. Like, do you yourself, Charnett, ever feel annoyed or feel like your work hasn't been taken into account? Is that ever the case? Because, chatting to Ruth, it seems that a lot of companies still do bad things. So like from your end, do you ever see it like that? If that makes sense?
I think from our end, we struggle with getting data, or there might have been some sort of, okay, let's try and do life cycle assessment on a product and see whether it fits into a system. But whenever we say, okay, well, you're going to have to give us data on how the product is made, or how this is going to work in terms of how does it then get disposed of. There's always some issues with regards to, I guess, IP. So in terms of, for instance, a lot of the bioplastic out there are novel materials. So then the additive they put in are not disclosed. And then it's a bit like, well, if you want us to do a life cycle assessment, then we do need to understand how this is made. And because it's blocked by IP or anything, we're not able to have a look at it. So, or there's cases where they might say it is, they're like when products come in and say they're totally biodegradable, and then you see the plastic coating is polypropylene, and you know that it's not biodegradable already. So it feels, I don't know, like normal consumers, I feel cheated on in terms of, okay, the product labeling is not correct, and you just want them to be able to, be more transparent in what your product is.
Ruth, you work with a lot of data, ethical consumer. So, I mean, do you ever run into the same sorts of issues that there perhaps on certain products, there's not enough information on the products or the companies themselves or the processes they use? Do you ever run into problems like that, or is it pretty out there? Is it pretty open at your end with the information?
No. So before we do a product guide, we always send a questionnaire to the companies, so they have the opportunity to give us more information than they might have put out publicly already. But more often than not, they don't reply. So we only can go then by what's out there on the internet, either on their own websites or reports or from other sources. So yeah, that's one thing. The way that companies report is so different across the different companies. So it's not like you always know where to look to find something. It might come under lots of different names. You might have to dig around and look for it. And I know there's people campaigning to change this across Europe. I think they about corporate transparency and how companies should report on their environmental and social impacts, so that it's easier for investors to see whether they want to invest in them or not. So they're trying to create more standardized methods of reporting so that it's easier to understand where companies, what they're doing.
I mean, if these companies aren't being transparent, you do end up with issues like you've mentioned. Like, I did not know about this sort of microplastics stuff. Well, what's the magazine printed on? Is it organic paper?
It is post-consumer recycled paper, and with I believe it's vegetable inks.
Oh wow! Okay.
It's not as unusual as it sounds.
I was going to try and catch you out. I should have known. I was never going to catch you out. So I think I've coming to the end of this chat. Like, going forward, what do you think people should go away from this episode, this conversation, knowing about plastics or society? Like, what should people go if they've just gone, I haven't really listened to this, they were talking a bit too much about Barclay cards and whatnot. What would you want them to take away from this? Ruth, I'm going to start with you to allow Charnett some time to think about this question.
There's more to what we buy than meets the eye. I didn't prepare that. We're led to believe that all of this stuff is available on the shelf and we can just have whatever we want, but there's loads of stories, real life impacts behind all of those things that we buy, and life cycle assessments and the kind of ratings that Ethical Consumer does on companies can really help people to understand what's behind those products, and then find alternatives, because there are alternatives and they're really worth supporting to change how things are done.
Wonderful. And Charnett, what about you? What would you want people going away from this?
At the Plastic Waste Innovation Hub, we always say that plastic isn't an unsustainable material. It's the system that is unsustainable. So plastic isn't the ultimate enemy. It's how we use it and how we put it back into our system, being able to dispose it correctly, or maybe even a cradle to cradle approach in terms of being able to use it over and over again is the way forward, is how I feel.
Ruth, Charnett, thank you so much for giving us your time. Like, this has been amazing. I've learned so much.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, great.
Join us next week, where we'll be joined by marine scientist Winnie Courtine-Jones and Professor Paul Anastas, the father of green chemistry, to discuss the tiny objects that have a devastating global impact, microplastics. It was produced by Hiren Joshi and Elisabeth Ratcliffe and presented by me, Dr. Alex Lathbridge. As always, if you want to learn a bit more about the RSC and plastics, you can visit rsc.li/plastics.